So, do you want to talk about what you think happened? The interview's already half over, so I'm not sure what to do with the science here, because we don't want to get overly lost in it, because I have some other questions, but people are probably wondering.
Well, in order to do what we just discussed, in order to have free fall, you have to eliminate the resistance. And the only plausible way that could have happened is for the use of explosives. When this was asked, did they look at explosives? The way they said was, well, they considered it was not a credible hypothesis. And they based that on there were no sounds that were loud enough. And what they did was they basically phonied up a very loud estimate of how much sound it would have generated to blow up one of these columns. And it was not at all a realistic estimate. And then they asserted that there were no sounds in the videos or in the reports that came up to that level of loudness, and therefore there were no explosives used. There were lots of reports of explosions, and there's audio evidence of explosions. In fact, the most recent of the videos that I've done, you can find out on my website. In fact, I put it way up at the very top. It's the most recent one. Go through there, and we found a video that actually has the recording of some of these sounds. There's a little brief interval where there's 2 blasts and a slight pause, and then 7 more very regularly spaced blasts, all within just a couple of seconds. One of the first responders described that he was listening to it. It went thoom, 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 just like that. That was Craig Bartmers, a policeman. That was part of his testimony. And it sounds just like that. You hear this sequence of blasts. This was done with a microphone very much like the one that's sticking in my face right now. It was something that was intended to pick up voices from inches away. And still in the background from several blocks away, it was picking up these explosions. If you watch other videos of Building 7 coming down, you will see that it does not show the whole event.
Well, actually, it seems to me I heard a tape over and over again about his name is well known. He's a very rich person who owned the building or something, that now's the time to pull the building, to pull it, which meant demolish it. So that's pretty big evidence, too.
Right. Silverstein was his name?
Right.
Yeah, as the owner of the World Trade Center, at least Building 7, and I think he was actually had leased the other buildings as well. But even beside him, he tries to wiggle out of that and saying he wasn't really saying to demolish it, but in the context of that's clear what he meant. But even to support that, there were so many other, if you just listen to the other testimony on the same day, there were so many other newscasters, and there were policemen and firemen all talking about how the building was either going to come down or they were going to take it down. They were sort of vague on just how. But there are so many reports that this was going to be taken down that you don't have to just rely on his. He was trying to imply that it was a last-minute decision that because of conditions they were going to make it happen. That's baloney, too. All of this is just trying to produce cover for what was really going on, which was the buildings had to have been prepared for demolition months in advance. All of this was a very well-orchestrated, very long process to get the buildings ready to demolish. Also, they had to be coordinated. The demolition of the buildings had to be coordinated with the flights. They had to be coordinated with the military to not shoot down the flights. They had to be coordinated with all the cover stories that were released right as things were happening. You have people explaining why Building 7 came down as Building 7 was coming down, and in some cases before Building 7 came down. They already had complete rationales for it. You even had to have the passports printed up and ready to place on the street in New York City and at the Pennsylvania crash site. I mean, we're getting into the area of the ridiculous here. But even those little things indicated foreknowledge and participation in the overall event. So there are things here that you don't have to be a scientist to see that this was an orchestrated event, top to bottom. And as soon as some of the elements you can see involved inside participation, it means everything had to have been orchestrated. Because if you knew Building 7 was going to come down, on the day that the planes hit the tower, you had to know the planes were going to hit the tower, for instance.
Well, there's so much to talk about, and I haven't actually been involved in any of this or keeping track of it for the last few years. I paid a lot of attention at the beginning and was organizing to get more information and to kind of wake people up around this whole story, which has in fact really changed our world. But then I don't know. I can't and don't need to give you a reason now why I pulled back from that and have been doing plenty of other things. But there certainly are a large number of people speaking up about a lot of different aspects of this story, and it's very important to hear what you have to say, David Chandler. In fact, I would like you in a few remaining minutes, or both of us, to talk about the growing movement and what's happening with this. So people are questioning the truth of the story of the World Trade Centers in 2001, which has, of course, been the justification for all kinds of serious wars and killing of so many people and just really, really serious stuff. So it is very important that people think about these things and not just buy the official story the way it's presented to justify very, very many things that are questionable. What's your opinion or what's your experience? Because you're much more involved in this than I am, to say the least.
Well, people like myself who have some technical background, some of the people I talk to, they have this, like a glaze comes over their eyes when you mention 9/11. Like, there's an attempt to discredit any kind of investigation of this and, to try to label people as kooks and, to the whole term conspiracy theory. It's sort of a term that has no substance to it because it's not about whether you do or don't believe there's a conspiracy. It's about whether you're accepting the government story or trying to assert that the government was somehow part of the evildoers, so to speak.
And one of the things that people say very often is, oh, it couldn't have been, those who say, the official story must be true because it would take too many people to have participated and know about it, and that couldn't keep that secret. And of course, a lot of people, I have the impression, have been speaking out, in fact.
Right. If you take security agencies, I'm not going to say the government, which is sort of a global thing, but there are agencies within the government that specialize in secrecy, they specialize in covert operations, and the whole nature of this is there's people who are out there doing things that under most circumstances would be seen as totally unconscionable, and yet they do it as part of their sense of, well, they're doing their bit for their country in some distorted kind of a way. So, yeah, there are people who are out there like that. And how it was pulled off, I don't know. I do know that we've destabilized countries all over the world, and there's so many of these things that go on in a general basis that all of a sudden, because it's happening within our own borders, that, well, it can't happen. Well, I think there are mechanisms out there for making these things happen. I don't really have to start at that end, though. I just look at the buildings, and I know these could not have come down the way they told us they did. I see blatant evidence of participation in a cover-up at a ludicrous level. There's no way this is for real, the way they tell us. And then you look at the physics of what's happening from a more technical perspective, it reinforces that. There's no way these buildings could crush themselves. I did a paper on the North Tower, on the way like a dozen floors at the top, coming down, supposedly crashing into the 98 undamaged floors. Remember, the fire was only one zone. Okay, so you get the floor started. Okay, let's just cut all those columns and let the whole thing drop. What's going to happen? Well, worst case scenario is the top section is going to crash onto the bottom section, and they're going to destroy each other. Well, by the time you've gotten 12 floors into the bottom section, the entire top section is going to be destroyed. So then what? How do you get 98 floors to be crushed by this small piece at the top? So even the most simple analysis like that leads you to say it couldn't have happened the way they showed. If you get into more detail, you know that it was even further from the truth. The top section of the building came down in such a way that it just accelerated right on through, meaning it was simply falling into pre-pulverized rubble. It was not crushing the bottom section of the building. And if you read the paper I did on the subject, that spells out the reasoning of that one. So there's so many ways that these buildings are clearly examples of something that was a set-up job. It was not something that happened in any kind of a natural, normal kind of a thing. That's the direction I come at it. All the rest just sort of follows on.
Yeah. And there's a lot of other people talking about it, too. Would you like to talk? Well, we only have about a minute, but just make reference to what you think is happening with this movement, if it is a movement of people speaking up, people from different fields and different angles.
Okay. I've been involved with architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. You know, there's about 1,000 architects and engineers who have looked at this and signed the petition. There's a lot of others. Anybody can go in there and you can make your own statement there as well. But they separate out those that are architects or engineers. I'm actually in the other category because I teach physics, and that's not an architect and that's not an engineer. And they're sort of picky about that. But that's one group. But there's an organization, Scientists for 9/11 Truth. There's Scholars for 9/11 Truth and Justice. I'm involved with trying to get another one, a group started that's just sort of an organization of independent researchers, and that's the International Center for 9/11 Studies. And I've been involved with several people who are pretty much independent researchers that are working with that one.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it's having an impact?
I have a saying of Gandhi that I fall back on. That I sort of lose track of the big picture, and because I'm focused on the little pieces of it myself. And the reason I'm involved in this is I feel like I have a niche where I can actually bring to bear some of the things that I know about. And this quote by Gandhi is that anything you do will be insignificant, but it's very important that you do it. Mm-hmm. So I use that as the basis. So I don't really have the answer. Where is this going to go? Well, hey, the Kennedy assassination thing, they blew that off for years and years, and it's never been resolved. You have many other things like this that have happened. And that could happen here as well. But that doesn't deter me because I think it's so important. The wars of 9/11 have not stopped. The justification for torture, the justification for taking away our rights, the justification for probing into our communications. You know, there's so many things that have turned this place. When I talk to people, they say, aren't you afraid, as though I'm in Nazi Germany or something, aren't you afraid to speak out? Well, why should I be afraid in a free country to speak out? And yet people sort of take it for granted that I really should be afraid to speak out. And maybe the reason I'm not afraid is just I'm too naive or something like that. But on the other hand, no, I think we need to, if we're going to have rights, we need to act on our rights and stand up and do what we know that we should be allowed to do, whether somebody's giving us permission or not.
Well, thank you very much, David Chandler, for doing what you're doing and speaking up and doing all this work that I'm sure nobody's paying you to do, at the very least. That's because you care. So, and thanks for this interview.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak, yes.
My name's Sue Cipriano. Thanks for listening. So, do you want to talk about what you think happened? The interview's already half over, so I'm not sure what to do with the science here because we don't want to get overly lost in it because I have some other questions, but people are probably wondering.
Well, in order to do what we just discussed, in order to have free fall, you have to eliminate the resistance. And the only plausible way that could have happened is for the use of explosives. When NIST was asked, did they look at explosives? The way they said was, well, they considered it was not a credible hypothesis. And they based that on there were no sounds that were loud enough. And what they did was they basically phonied up a very loud estimate of how much sound it would have generated to blow up one of these columns. And it was not at all a realistic estimate. And then they asserted that there were no sounds in the videos or a recent one. Go through there, and we found a video that actually has the recording of some of these sounds. There's a little brief interval where there's 2 blasts and a slight pause, and then 7 more very regularly spaced blasts, all within just a couple of seconds. The reports that came up to that level of loudness, and therefore there were no explosives used. There were lots of reports of explosions, and there's audio evidence of explosions. In fact, the most recent of the videos that I've done, you can find out on my website. In fact, I put it way up at the very top. It's the most